So we've covered the basics of what kind of tools and products you may need in the last video. If you haven't seen that one yet, the link's at the bottom of the video description below. In this video, we'll take a look inside the airbrush as well as talk about how to give your airbrush a complete overhaul. It's important to note that you should never have to completely disassemble an airbrush. If you are diligent about keeping your airbrush clean, you should be okay. But there are times that you might want to give it a good spring cleaning, and I'll show you how here. So here we have the chrome airbrush, and this is a dual gravity airbrush. So this is the type of airbrush that we will be using in a hobby. So let's go ahead and take a look at it. It's a very good example to use because most, dual action gravity airbrush are usually kind of made the same. So, little differences here and there, but this is a good place to start. So first of all, you should never ever really need to take this thing completely apart. Maybe once in a blue moon do some spring cleaning or what have you, or if there's some kind of trouble with your airbrush, and hopefully that will never happen or happens rarely. Okay, so let's take a look at the chrome and its parts, take it apart, and as we're doing it, I'll show you exactly how to do a full spring cleaning of your airbrush and complete maintenance of it. What you will need is, of course, your airbrush and lube. Okay, it could be Rag Dab, or it could be the Iwata brand of lube. Okay, either way, it works well. There's other brands out there as well, but those are the two that I know of that I could actually repeat and say it actually works. But it's lube, but who cares? So let's take a look at the chrome airbrush. There you go, chrome airbrush, dual action, gravity feed. Take off the cap here as we're not going to use it. Okay, so first thing you will notice is basically there's two ends to the airbrush that you're going to be worried about. You got the tip here, and you got the end here. Okay, obviously simple, basic stuff. The chrome here has a thumb and finger rest here. It makes it easier to hold the airbrush. Okay, so most airbrush don't usually have this. This does come apart. Underneath this, what the rest is covering is the trigger valve. Okay, the trigger valve here is what has a spring release for the trigger. When you press down, it releases air into the airbrush. Okay, so this part here is what controls the air going into the airbrush when you press down on the trigger. When you pull back, it pulls back the needle. Okay, opens up the air hole here and then releases paint. Okay, as the paint's being released, it gets pulled by the air. Okay, and out of your airbrush. Pretty simple mechanics. I guess you don't really need to know anything else. So let's go ahead and take off the handle here, and very careful, especially if you have the chrome, to make sure there's any O-rings hanging about here. This one has an O-ring on here. I lose this all the time, and it's a pain in the ass. And, probably won't do much to your airbrush, but it's better to make sure it's there. So make sure that you have this part every time you put it back in, that it hasn't fallen off anywhere or been eaten by the carpet monster. Okay, everything else on the end here you really don't need to take apart. This does come apart, the rear adjustment here, but you don't really need to take that apart, so we won't worry about here. Okay, now the next thing you want to do is unscrew the needle chuck. This is what holds the needle into place. Okay, and you carefully just pull the needle out gently. Okay, put it down gently. Now this is where it gets a little complicated. You can bend your needle here anytime, so make sure you're stored it at a nice, safe place where you don't mash it in or anything. Okay, at this point the trig comes off. Okay, just pulls right out. Simple as that. And the next thing we'll do is unscrew the tube shank here. Just keep unscrewing until it comes off. Very basic. Okay, so the tube shank falls off here, and we'll go and take that apart. Alright, so the tube shank comes off here, and inside the tube shank is the spring, and the spring, what it does is makes the needle tube springy, so that your trigger gets pushed back every time you pull back on it. Alright, normally when you do a spring cleaning here, you don't really need to take this part out. There's a spring in there, but if you want to, you can. Just go ahead and screw the spring screw right here at the end. We'll go ahead and do it for this purpose here. Okay, and then out comes your spring. Okay, now make sure you don't lose that part. Now again, you don't need to take this part off. There's really no purpose. You do it maybe once in a really long time, because what we could do, go ahead and lube this up if we wanted to. So we have the back part taken apart. Now we're going to go ahead and take apart the front part. Oh, by the way, this fell off, which totally complete completely forgot, is the back lever. So just pull that out, it comes apart like that. So here on the front, take off the spray regulator. This is the spray regulator. Pull that out, okay. At this point you have to be very careful not to bend the tip. This is the needle tip right here that's protruding out, okay. So we'll go ahead and unscrew the hold down ring. Now you have to be very careful here. This is what's holding down that needle tip. You have to be very careful about that, okay, because if you mess up the needle tip, you're gonna have to get a new one. Now the needle tip, unlike other brands, the Badger needle tip does sit on its own self here. There's nothing, you don't need a wrench or anything to screw it in. I don't know what other brands have this, but I know Badger don't need a wrench to do that. So carefully take out the needle tip, okay, and you're ready to go. This is all taken apart. There is no need, absolutely no need to take apart the trigger valve. Okay, if you do that, then there's something wrong there, and there's a lot of little parts in here that you'll easily lose. So don't ever take that apart. You don't need to. Okay, so there you have it, taking it apart. Now we'll put it back together. Now, when we do a spring cleaning, this is what I would do. Once I have everything taken apart, there should be absolutely no paint anywhere on these parts other than possibly the needle, which there should never be any paint on the needle when you're pulling it out in the first place. Okay, the needle tip, this little part here, and possibly the regulator right here. Those three little parts, put it in the middle of the screen here, are the only parts that really should have any paint on them at all. Okay, any paint on them at all. So what I would do is you could try to like clean it out with maybe tissue or what have you, but that's a little hard to do. What you can do is really get a nice clean is just put it into an ultrasonic cleaner, just these three parts. You don't need to put anything else in the ultrasonic cleaner. And then just let it run for maybe 120 seconds, 2 minutes. Let it run a couple of times, and you'll be good. It'll be nice, squeaky clean. You take it back out, and then put your airbrush back together again. Now, in putting the airbrush back together again, this is what we'll need for the lube. And you don't really have to do this, but every so blue moon, and this is what I call the complete overhaul, because you don't really need to take it apart at all. Only when you, really need to get a nice cleaning. And I might do a spring cleaning on my airbrush every maybe 4 or 5 months, maybe more. It depends on how it feels. Okay, so we're going to put this back together, and this is where we're going to start using the lube. Okay, so after you've gave it the needle regulator and the needle tip, which knowing me probably lost, there we go. That is all cleaned, and you're satisfied with how clean it is. Go and put this baby back together again. First thing we do is go ahead and place the needle tip back into the shell here. So in this case, you really don't want to mess with anything and put lube on it. There's really no need. It sits in there perfectly, just fine. Pretty easy. Okay, and I'm gonna set this down, that might fall off. Take the lube. We go ahead and lube up the hold down ring here. Just give it a little, just a tiny bit. Don't need that much. Okay. Squeeze them out. Put it around the threads. Use your finger and spread it out. And this is where it gets very lubey. You wipe your hands. Put it in. Secure the needle tip into place. That, like so. Go ahead and give it a little lube here. Again, just spread it with your thumb. That's all you really need, or your finger. That's all you really need. Put the reservoir back in. Or sorry, the regulator back in, not the reservoir. Careful not to bend the needle tip. Okay, it's very important that you be careful with the needle tip here, because it could actually really easily warp. I found out over the years. If that happens, you might not get paint coming out, might even get air coming out. There's sometimes that air and paint does come out, but it bubbles out back into the cup, or some other things like that. When you see that kind of behavior, it probably means your needle tip's probably warped. Okay, so that your needle, when it sits into the needle tip, isn't flush against each other. So what happens is air sometimes get spitted out and stuff like that. And all you have to do is probably buy a replacement for the needle tip. The needle tip is probably like, I don't know, maybe 10 bucks. It's probably less than 10 bucks, but. So you got this part set in. It's nice and yummy there. Let's go ahead and do the back end here. The back end here, let's go ahead and put the spring back into the tube shank. Go ahead and put some lube on the spring. Okay, spread it around a bit. Nice and lubey. Go ahead and stick it in. And if you wish, we'll go ahead and move this here. Just to keep the threads nice and oily, so you don't get any stripping. Helps with, you know, stripping a little. Goes back in. That way next time when you need to take it apart, it won't be too hard to unscrew. So we got that back in. We'll go ahead and stick in the needle tube here, which goes right in here. And if you look carefully, see how it's shaped? Okay, you just want to just get it in there and push in like that. Of course, you could go ahead and we'll go ahead and lube up this part as well. Keep the parts nice and oiled up. Okay, maybe that's just fine. Take it, put it in, and make sure it's flushed in so that you can push it all the way in, like this. Okay. It's good. Nice. We'll go ahead and move up this part here without getting it all over the place, which I'm very, very famous on doing because I am a klutz sometimes. Okay, so we'll go ahead and start screwing this in. Okay, while this is going in, keep this in mind that it's flushed up against, you can pull all the way back. While we're doing that, we'll go ahead and put in the back lever. Very simply, just stick it in, and turn it around. Voila, sits in there nice and easy. Let's go ahead and screw it, twist it back in. Keep in mind to keep it in the full flush like this, and then as you screw it in, it will push down on the back lever here, so that now you get that spring action here. The back lever should be pushing the needle tube back like this. So screw it to your desired amount. Usually I just screw it all the way in. Okay, got the back lever is nice and smooth. Okay, and then what we will do is go ahead and put the trigger back in. Very simply, just pull back on the back lever here, and then make sure that the holes of the trigger are facing the right way, which is back and forward. Put it in, make sure it sets on top of the trigger valve, and then there's a little push button right about here where the trigger will sit on top. If it doesn't sit on top, it won't push down very well. But right here, it's pushing down perfectly. Okay, so there you have it. Put that in there, and then now we could put in the needle if you want. Go ahead and coat this up a little. And again, if you haven't seen my video on prolonging dry tip, this is how you would do it. Before each session, you would go ahead and lube up the needle. What that does is prevent tip dry from happening too often. Okay, and it does work. And you get about maybe 4 hours of usage out of it before you need to coat the needle again. So then simply just put it back in very carefully without bumping the needle. Now before you start pushing it all the way in, make sure the trigger is in nice and set. Okay, otherwise you're going to bump the needle up against the trigger and then ding your needle, and you don't want to do that. Carefully just push it in as far as it goes. Okay, and don't force it. Okay, once you see the needle come out, go as far back as you can, and you're ready to put on the chuck. We'll go ahead and lube this up a little here. Okay, and then we'll go ahead and put it in a little chuck. And voila! And of course you could go ahead and lube up this here if you want. Might as well. Okay. And again, careful of the O-ring here. Don't want to lose that. It's very important. Because once you lose it, it's gone. And just simply screw it back on. And there you have it. Okay, you might want to get a paper towel and just wipe off some of that excess oil I got all over the place. And you have a nice, clean, complete airbrush. All the insides are nice and lubed up so that everything is nice and smooth when you're using it. And there you have it, guys. The way to what I do to do a complete spring cleaning on airbrush and how I take it apart and stuff like that. So I hope this video gave you an insight on how an airbrush is put together and how it should be properly maintained when you want to do a complete overhaul. If you got any comments or suggestions, please post them down in the comments below. And if you have more detailed questions, send me a message on YouTube or Facebook. This video will be added to a new playlist called Airbrushing Intermediate, so you guys can find all the videos in this series. In the next video, we'll talk about how to do color changes, so stay tuned for that. Thanks guys for watching and happy airbrushing.